And ultimately, 4 of these men were hanged. One of them, Louis Ling, committed suicide, cheated the hangman, as the anarchists said, committed suicide on death row in Chicago.
Who was Louis Ling?
Louis Ling was a young German anarchist, was the most overtly radical and militant of the anarchists. He actually was making bombs. He wasn't at Haymarket, so it wasn't him who threw the bomb. People were preparing for street warfare. And so that was enough for the press and the jury, the fact that people were preparing for this and saying this might be necessary. It didn't really matter that they'd actually done it. And ultimately, Albert Parsons, August Spies, George Engel, and Adolf Fischer are all hanged, and they become known around the world, even to this day, as the Haymarket Martyrs. Because after the execution takes place, it's celebrated in America by all the press, but around the world, people believe a great injustice has been done, and people died. Really, these are the first martyrs for the cause of industrial freedom, as Eugene Debs put it.
How did Parsons get connected? You said he had gone off to a saloon with his wife and kids.
Right. He was really tried, I think, because he was the most important leader of the anarchist movement and the labor movement in Chicago. He wasn't even present during the bombing. There was hardly anything to link him to it. In fact, he fled the city, and his defense lawyer persuaded him to come back and said, there's no way you can be convicted of this crime because you had nothing to do with it. But in fact, he was, and he was sentenced to death. Was offered clemency by the governor, said if you sign a recantation, you can save your life and spend the rest of your life in prison, and he refused.
And Spies.
Yeah, Spies was there at the time and was accused of being connected directly with the bombing. But there was a trial, sort of the trial of the century, and there was a tremendous amount of contradictory testimony indicating that he really didn't have anything to do with actually throwing the bomb.
Can you talk about how their language, how their speeches, their writings were used against them?
Yes, well, they believed that it was simply a matter of time before the police and the militia, the businessmen had their own militia, by the way, would intervene in one of these demonstrations.
Wait, on that, by the way, what do you mean the businessmen had their own militia?
The militia in Chicago and other cities were privately raised armed forces. You could fund your own militia company. And the interesting thing in Chicago is the workers, in reaction to this, formed their own militia, which were outlawed by the state of Illinois.
Pinkerton came from Chicago?
And Pinkerton was based there. So Chicago was really an armed camp. That's the only way to put it. And it looked like something very seriously violent was going to happen. So Spies and Parsons said, you better be ready. You better have arms. By the way, the Constitution says you have the right to bear arms. And you better make bombs. And guess what? There's no law against that either. So they were prepared to really go to war. They had been fighting the Pinkertons in the streets. And so this was a very volatile situation.
What do you mean they'd been fighting the Pinkertons? Who were the Pinkertons? Well,
the Pinkertons were private police that were hired by the employers who wanted to beef up their security. And the Pinkertons had actually killed people in Chicago. They were also remembered as the ones who hung the Molly Maguires, the Irish miners who were regarded as being innocent of the crime that they committed. So it was almost an unarmed conflict situation that they were preparing for.
Alan Pinkerton had established the company and hired veteran soldiers?
Veteran soldiers and people who were out of work to go in and be informers and to be really hired gunmen and really to protect strikebreakers. That was their main job because the employers weren't sure they could always count on the police. Police were immigrant workers themselves, and sometimes they said, well, you know, we're not intervening here. That was part of the problem in Chicago at first.
So you had these militias. You also had the police. How did they stand in relation to the militias?
Well, at first the police were under the control of the mayor, who was pro-worker, pro-union, and you had situations where strikebreakers would be brought into plants, and the Chicago police would say, well, it's not our job to protect them. If you want to bring them in, that's your business. But something happened about a year before Haymarket, and the mayor lost control of the police. And a new captain came in who really wanted to do what the businessmen wanted, which was to prevent strikes, to back up lockouts, to prevent rallies. And so, you know, there's clearly a situation where trouble is going to take place in Chicago, and it has to do with this shift in the use of police and the fact that you have Pinkertons and militia in the streets.
Can you talk, Professor Green, about the day that the men were hung?
Yes, this was November 11th, 1887, and people around the world knew that for a long time that these men would be sentenced to death. But something happened in the Cook County Jail which was quite extraordinary, is that the anarchists on the gallows seemed to be choreographing their own death scene. And they gave these speeches which in some ways sound like they could come from a Shakespeare play or something like that. And August Bee said, you know, you may silence us now, but our memory will survive us. And Albert Parsons' last words were fighting for free speech even at the last breath. And when they died, when they were executed, the people in the room who were all witnesses who wanted them to die were kind of stunned and saddened, according to the newspapers, about this. So almost immediately, people in Chicago said, well, maybe something was done here that was wrong. And that was certainly true around the world.
And Lucy Parsons?
Lucy Parsons lived on, carried on the struggle until 1942, and the struggle for her really was to preserve her husband's memory and the memory of the cause that he died for. And in the end, her last May Day is in 1941. She's an 88-year-old woman. She's blind, and she's going through the streets of Chicago on a CIO union parade on a float, and she became a kind of a living saint at that end of her life for the new labor movement coming to Chicago, unionizing the stockyards and the steel mills. And there was a real connection between that and what had happened before.
And how did the Haymarket killings and the hangings of the four men shape the modern-day labor movement?
Well, I think that initially it had a very negative impact on the American Federation of Labor, the mainstream. The labor movement wanted nothing to do with the memory of these men. In fact, that's one of the reasons why May Day wasn't celebrated here. And instead, Labor Day became the national holiday rather than the international holiday. But somehow, I try to explain this in the book, the memory of these men wouldn't die. It kept being recreated by people in the labor movement who wanted a broader movement, wanted a labor movement that would go into the streets, wanted a labor movement that would strike even if it was against the law, wanted a labor movement that would use boycotts. And so that's why their memory keeps getting revived.
Is there a monument to them in Chicago?
Well, there is. There's a cemetery, Waldheim Cemetery, a non-denominational cemetery outside of the city. The mayor wouldn't let them be buried in the city of Chicago, which has become a kind of international shrine. And not only are the Haymarket anarchists buried there, but 69 other people of the left, including Emma Goldman and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, are buried there. But nothing exists in the city of Chicago except a new monument, which is not to the police, and not to the anarchists, but to the fragility of free speech. And you have to go there to see it because it's an abstract group of figures that are supposed to represent what happened in Haymarket as a kind of national tragedy.
Last comments on this May Day, where millions are observing this day by honoring immigrants standing up for immigrant rights around the country.
Well, it does appear as though what goes around comes around in a way that people are feeling the need to go into the streets, to take extraordinary action, and to do it as part of an international community of workers. That's what was important about May Day of 1886, is that people were demonstrating not only as U.S. citizens, but as citizens of the world, the larger world community of workers. And that's what I see happening today, because of course in Indonesia and the Philippines, people are demonstrating. And they are here too, and using some of the same tactics, the boycott, the staying away from work, that were really began in 1886.
And for people to remember that going back then is where we got the 8-hour day.
Yes, that's where it started, and people had to sacrifice their lives for what took many, many years. Not until 1938 did the struggle finally succeed.